Imagine you're a decorated U.S. Army general, returning home after months of serving your country abroad. The night is quiet, the streets familiar, and all you can think about is seeing your family. But in an instant, everything changes. A routine traffic stop turns into an unjust arrest because of the color of your skin. The humiliation, the fear, the anger, and it's all caught on camera. What happens next isn't just about you. It ignites a nationwide movement, and suddenly, you're the face of a fight for justice that's been brewing for far too long. Before we dive into today's powerful story, let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and be sure to hit that subscribe button. General Michael Anderson had been away from home for months. The mission overseas had been grueling, but deeply fulfilling. His role as a U.S. Army general often took him to war-torn regions, where he was tasked with overseeing humanitarian aid efforts and providing relief to those suffering the devastating effects of conflict. But this time, it wasn't war that had called him abroad. It was peace. His unit had been assigned to help rebuild communities, restore stability, and deliver essential supplies to people in need. That kind of work wasn't easy, but it made all the difference. Tonight, however, all of that was behind him. Michael was finally back on U.S. soil, navigating the familiar streets of his hometown in the quiet, late hours. The freeway was mostly empty, just a few cars moving in and out of the lanes as they sped toward their own destinations. It was peaceful, almost eerily so. For the first time in weeks, Michael allowed himself to relax, feeling the tension ease out of his shoulders as he thought about seeing his family again. As he passed through the streets of Columbus, Ohio, he smiled, thinking of his wife and 2 children waiting for him at home. His daughter, Emily, had texted him a picture just a few hours ago, showing off the new dress she'd gotten for her upcoming school play. His son, Thomas, had been practicing for his basketball game, and Michael couldn't wait to catch up on everything he'd missed. The green glow of a traffic light illuminated the road ahead, and Michael slowed as he approached the intersection. He was just a few minutes from home now, close enough that he could already imagine the warmth of his family's embrace. But as he crossed through the intersection, something caught his eye in the rearview mirror, a set of red and blue lights flashing behind him. At first, Michael didn't think much of it. He'd always been respectful of the law, never the type to speed or break traffic rules. He assumed it was a routine check, maybe something to do with a broken taillight. Still, he pulled over to the side of the road and parked his car, rolling down the window as the officer approached. "Evening, officer," Michael greeted calmly as he reached for his driver's license. His voice was measured, polite. He had no reason to be anything but cooperative. The officer, a man named Paul Jackson, stood tall beside the window, his flashlight scanning the inside of Michael's car. Something in his expression shifted, a flicker of suspicion flashing across his face as he took in Michael's appearance. His dark skin, the fatigues he still wore from his mission. "License and registration," Officer Jackson said curtly, his tone sharp and unfriendly. Michael complied without hesitation, handing over the documents. He knew better than to question authority, especially in these kinds of situations. But as Jackson took the license in hand, the tension in the air grew. There was an unease between them now, something that hadn't been there moments ago. "Where are you coming from?" Jackson asked, his tone hardening. "Just returning home from work," Michael replied, keeping his voice even. "I'm a U.S. Army general. I've just returned from a humanitarian mission." Officer Jackson's eyes narrowed, the suspicion on his face deepening. "Is that right?" "Yes, sir," Michael said, his patience still holding steady. He'd been in enough tense situations to know how to de-escalate, and he wasn't about to let this get out of hand. But Officer Jackson wasn't looking for calm. He leaned closer to the window, his hand resting on the grip of his gun. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered. Michael blinked, caught off guard by the sudden aggression. "Is there a problem, officer?" "I said step out of the vehicle," Jackson repeated, his voice rising. There was no choice now. Michael sighed softly and opened the door, stepping out into the cool night air. His hands were in plain sight, every movement deliberate and slow. This wasn't the first time he'd dealt with a difficult officer. But something about this encounter felt different, darker, more charged with tension. He could feel the hostility radiating from Jackson, the underlying bias that had nothing to do with his driving or his car. As Michael stood beside his vehicle, Officer Jackson circled around him, his gaze scrutinizing every detail, looking for something, anything, that would justify his suspicions. The longer it went on, the more obvious it became. This wasn't about a traffic violation. "You got anything in the car I should know about?" Jackson asked. "No, sir. Just my personal belongings," Michael answered, still calm, though his patience was wearing thin. Jackson's lips curled into a sneer. "We'll see about that." Before Michael could say another word, Jackson was already pulling out his radio, calling for backup. Within minutes, more police vehicles arrived, lights flashing as officers began surrounding Michael. The situation had escalated far beyond what was necessary. Bystanders started gathering, their cell phones raised, recording the unfolding drama. In the age of social media, everything was captured, and this would be no exception. Michael remained composed, refusing to let the fear take hold. He'd faced worse situations in his career, life and death decisions in war zones, commanding troops under fire. But this was different. This was his home, his country, and yet here he was, treated like a criminal simply because of the color of his skin. The next moments were a blur. Despite Michael's cooperation, he was suddenly and aggressively detained, his hands cuffed behind his back as Officer Jackson continued his baseless accusations. The crowd that had gathered was growing restless, their voices rising in protest. But nothing seemed to matter. Jackson had already made up his mind. Michael was wrongfully arrested that night, taken away in front of dozens of witnesses. His military status, his service to his country, none of it mattered in that moment. The only thing that mattered to Officer Jackson was what he saw in front of him, a black man who, in his mind, fit the profile of a criminal. Michael sat in the back of the police cruiser, staring out the window as the world passed him by. The cold metal of the handcuffs dug into his wrists, a harsh reminder of the reality he found himself in. The sirens blared, slicing through the stillness of the night. It felt surreal, like a bad dream he couldn't wake up from. How had things spiraled so quickly? One moment he was driving home, and the next he was being treated like a dangerous criminal. The frustration bubbled beneath the surface, but Michael fought to keep it contained. He was no stranger to keeping his emotions in check. Years of military service had trained him well in that regard. But this was different. This was personal. The police station loomed ahead, a sterile building bathed in harsh fluorescent light. As the cruiser pulled into the parking lot, Michael took a deep breath, preparing himself for what was to come. He was no stranger to confrontation, but the injustice of the situation gnawed at him. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, about to be booked like a common criminal. Once inside, the process moved quickly. Fingerprints were taken, his belongings were confiscated, and he was led to a holding cell. The officer on duty barely spared him a glance, treating him with the same cold indifference that had defined the entire encounter. Michael's mind was racing. He knew he had to stay calm, but the unfairness of it all was overwhelming. Hours passed, though it felt like days. The cold of the cell seeped into his bones, and Michael leaned against the wall, his thoughts a whirlwind. What would his family think? His wife, his children. They would be waiting for him, expecting him to walk through the door at any moment. And instead, he was here, behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. But outside the walls of that cell, something was brewing. The footage of Michael's arrest had already hit social media, and it was spreading like wildfire. Bystanders had captured every moment of the incident, the unjust detainment, the aggressive treatment, and Michael's calm compliance throughout. The video, shared with captions of disbelief and outrage, struck a chord with people across the country. "Look at how they treat him. This man did nothing wrong," one comment read. "Another innocent black man treated like a criminal. This has to stop," echoed another. Footage spread to news outlets, and soon, Michael's face was plastered across television screens nationwide. People were watching, angry and frustrated at yet another instance of racial profiling. Tests began to spring up in cities across the U.S. Los Angeles, Atlanta, Philadelphia. Crowds gathered outside police stations, demanding justice and accountability. In Columbus, where it all started, the streets were flooded with protesters. Signs bearing phrases like, "No justice, no peace," and "End racial profiling" waved in the air as voices chanted for change. People from all walks of life, young, old, black, white, stood together, united in their demand for justice. Inside the station, Michael remained unaware of the storm brewing outside. His mind was on his family, wondering if they knew what had happened, if they had seen the footage. The weight of it all pressed down on him like a heavy cloak. He had spent his life serving his country, and now, here he was, betrayed by the very system he had sworn to protect. Hours later, Michael was finally released, though no apologies were given. The charges against him had been dropped, but the damage was done. He walked out of the station into a world that had already been set aflame by the injustice of his arrest. Reporters swarmed him as soon as he stepped outside, cameras flashing and microphones thrust into his face. "General Anderson, do you have anything to say about your arrest? How do you feel about the protests happening across the country? Do you believe this was an act of racial profiling?" Michael stood there, frozen for a moment. The weight of their questions hung in the air, but he didn't have the words. Not yet. He had just spent the last several hours treated like less than human, like he was a threat, simply because of how he looked. He needed time to process, to think about how to respond. His lawyer, who had arrived shortly after his release, guided him through the crowd of reporters and into a waiting car. Michael sank into the seat, the noise of the protest fading behind him as they drove away from the station. His thoughts were a jumbled mess, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Back at home, his wife Sarah was waiting for him. She stood on the front porch, her face a mixture of relief and fear, as she saw the car pull up. As soon as Michael stepped out, she rushed to him, wrapping him in a tight embrace. "I've been so worried," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I saw the video. I can't believe this happened." Michael held her close, the weight of the night's events pressing down on him. "I'm okay," he said softly, though he wasn't sure he believed it himself. They stood there for a long moment, the quiet of the neighborhood a stark contrast to the chaos that had unfolded earlier. Outside, their children were asleep, blissfully unaware of the storm that had swept through their father's life. For now, at least, there was peace. But Michael knew that peace wouldn't last. The world outside was demanding answers, and sooner or later, he would have to give them. The next few days were a blur of media attention and public outcry. News outlets played the footage of his arrest on repeat, dissecting every moment. Commentators debated the issue of racial profiling, some calling for reform in law enforcement, while others tried to justify the officer's actions. The divide in public opinion was stark, but the majority stood firmly on Michael's side. Tests continued to grow, with thousands of people taking to the streets to demand justice. The pressure on the police department mounted as calls for Officer Jackson's suspension grew louder. The department issued a statement saying they were conducting an internal investigation into the incident. But that wasn't enough for the protesters. They wanted action, accountability. Michael, meanwhile, remained quiet. Despite the mounting pressure for him to speak publicly, he held off, choosing to focus on his family in the wake of the ordeal. His wife Sarah was supportive, but he could see the strain it had placed on her. Their children were asking questions. Why had Daddy been arrested? What did he do wrong? And there were no easy answers. One evening, as Michael sat at the kitchen table, his phone buzzed with yet another message. It was his lawyer, urging him to make a public statement. The pressure was immense. Everyone wanted to hear from him, the man at the center of a national controversy. But what could he say? He had spent his entire life upholding the values of justice and fairness, serving his country with honor. And yet, here he was, a victim of the very injustice he had fought against. As Michael stared at his phone, a thought began to form in his mind. This wasn't just about him. It wasn't just about one man being wrongfully arrested. This was about a system, a deeply flawed system that allowed these kinds of injustices to happen, again and again. And if he stayed silent, he would be complicit in allowing that system to continue. He couldn't let that happen. Michael leaned back in his chair, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. For a moment, the kitchen seemed too small, the walls too close. He could hear the faint sounds of his children playing upstairs, unaware of the storm that was brewing around their family. But Michael knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. Soon, they would be old enough to understand what had happened. They would see the world for what it truly was, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Sarah entered the kitchen quietly, her soft footsteps barely audible on the tile floor. She sat across from him, her eyes searching his face. She could see the exhaustion in his expression, the inner turmoil that had been simmering since the night of the arrest. "You know you can't avoid it forever," she said gently. "People are waiting to hear from you." Michael sighed, running a hand over his face. "I know," he admitted. "But what do I even say? How do I put all of this into words?" Sarah reached across the table, placing her hand over his. "You tell them the truth. You tell them what's in your heart. That's all anyone can ask of you." He met her gaze, and in that moment, he felt a surge of gratitude for the woman he had married. She had always been his rock, his voice of reason when the world around him seemed to crumble. He nodded slowly, knowing she was right. The next morning, Michael sat in front of the camera, a simple setup in his living room, just him and his words. There would be no flashy production, no carefully scripted speech. He wanted this to be real, raw, and honest. Sarah sat beside him, offering silent support as he prepared to make his statement. The video would be broadcasted live on several social media platforms, allowing people across the country to tune in. Protesters had been waiting for this moment, hoping to hear from the man at the center of their fight for justice. Michael took a deep breath, feeling the weight of their expectations. He knew that what he said today could shape the course of the movement. As the camera light blinked on, Michael looked directly into the lens, his face calm but determined. He had spent his life speaking to soldiers, commanding troops in some of the most dangerous parts of the world. But this felt different. This wasn't about strategy or battle plans. This was about humanity. "Good morning," he began, his voice steady. "For those of you who don't know me, my name is Michael Anderson. I'm a husband, a father, and a U.S. Army general. I've spent the last 20 years of my life serving this country, doing my best to protect the freedoms that we all hold dear. But today, I'm not here as a soldier. I'm here as a man who was wrongfully arrested by the very system I swore to protect." He paused for a moment, letting the weight of his words sink in. "On that night, I was pulled over for a routine traffic stop. What should have been a simple interaction quickly escalated into something far more dangerous. I was detained, arrested, and treated like a criminal for no other reason than the color of my skin. And that is unacceptable." Michael's voice grew firmer as he continued, the anger he had kept buried for days finally surfacing. "This isn't just about me. This is about every black man and woman who has been mistreated, profiled, and targeted by a system that is supposed to serve and protect us. This is about a deep-seated bias that exists within law enforcement, a bias that puts our lives at risk every single day." The comments section of the live stream lit up, messages of support and outrage flooding in from viewers across the country. Michael didn't stop to read them. His focus was on the message he needed to deliver. "I want to be clear," he said, his tone unwavering. "This isn't about vilifying all police officers. I've worked alongside many men and women in uniform who are dedicated to their jobs and to serving their communities with honor. But we cannot ignore the fact that there is a problem, a systemic problem that has allowed these kinds of injustices to continue for far too long. He glanced down for a moment, gathering his thoughts before speaking again. Change isn't going to happen overnight, but it has to start somewhere. It has to start with accountability, with better training, and with a commitment to justice for all people, regardless of the color of their skin. I'm calling for reform, not just in our police departments, but in our entire justice system. We need to confront the biases that exist within it, and we need to do it now. Michael paused, his eyes reflecting the gravity of the moment. I know this is a difficult conversation. I know it's uncomfortable for some people to face these truths. But we can't turn a blind eye anymore. We can't keep pretending that this isn't happening. It's time to do better. It's time to be better. He let out a slow breath, the tension in his chest easing slightly as the words flowed out of him. This was what needed to be said. This was the truth. I'm not asking for sympathy, Michael said, his voice softening. I'm asking for change. For my children. For your children. For all of us. This fight isn't over, but I believe we can win it. Together. With that, he ended the broadcast, the screen fading to black as the weight of his words lingered in the silence. Sarah reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. You did great, she whispered. Michael nodded, though he wasn't sure how he felt. He had spoken his truth, but what came next? The protests were still raging, the demand for justice still echoing in the streets. And Officer Jackson? He had yet to face any real consequences for his actions. The internal investigation was still ongoing, but Michael knew how these things often played out. Too often, the officer would walk away with little more than a slap on the wrist. But this time felt different. The nation was watching, waiting for justice. And Michael wasn't going to let it slip away. In the days that followed, Michael's video statement became the catalyst for even larger protests. People took to the streets in record numbers, demanding not only justice for Michael, but also systemic reform across the board. The public outcry was impossible to ignore. News anchors debated the need for police reform, and activists rallied around Michael's call for accountability. But amid the growing pressure, Officer Jackson remained silent. The media had tracked down his personal details, but he refused to make a public statement. Speculation swirled about whether he would face charges or be placed on administrative leave, but the department remained tight-lipped about the outcome of their investigation. Behind the scenes, however, something was beginning to shift. Officer Jackson's colleagues had seen the footage. Some of them were shocked by his behavior, while others weren't surprised at all. Jackson had always been tough, but there was an edge to him, a certain intolerance that had been overlooked in the past. Now, it was impossible to ignore. As the investigation continued, Jackson began to feel the weight of his actions. He hadn't expected the arrest to blow up the way it had. In his mind, he was just doing his job, following protocol. But as the days passed, the realization began to sink in. He hadn't just made a mistake. He had let his own biases dictate his actions, and now an innocent man had paid the price. Officer Paul Jackson sat at his kitchen table, his head resting in his hands. The constant buzz of his phone on the countertop had become a dull background noise, another reminder of the storm that was swirling outside. The messages from his colleagues, the media inquiries, and even the death threats. They all merged into one relentless hum that he couldn't shut out. He had never expected things to go this far. In his mind, that night had been like any other. Routine. He had pulled Michael Anderson over, just like he had done with hundreds of other drivers. But now, as the days stretched on and the protests grew larger, Jackson found himself wrestling with a truth he had refused to see before. This wasn't routine. What he had done wasn't justified. At first, Jackson had convinced himself that he was just doing his job, following protocol. But the more he watched the footage of the incident, Michael's calm demeanor, the bystanders' voices in the background, the unnecessary aggression in his own actions, the more he realized how deeply he had messed up. His mind raced back to the moments before the arrest, that spark of suspicion he felt the moment he saw Michael behind the wheel. He had chalked it up to experience, to his instinct as a cop. But deep down, he knew better. It wasn't instinct. It was bias. A bias that he had carried for years, never questioning it, never realizing the damage it could cause. Jackson stood from the table, pacing the small confines of his kitchen. Outside, the world was demanding justice. Justice for Michael. Justice for all the others who had suffered at the hands of police. And Jackson? He was being forced to confront a part of himself he had long ignored. The investigation was still ongoing, but Jackson already knew what they would find. The footage didn't lie. He had made the arrest without cause. And now, he had to live with the consequences. His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone buzzing again, this time with a text from his superior at the precinct. Meeting at 2 p.m. Don't be late. Jackson's stomach churned. He knew what was coming. There had been too much attention, too much backlash. The department was going to make an example out of him. And maybe they should. Meanwhile, across town, Michael was slowly coming to terms with the aftermath of his public statement. The video had been viewed millions of times, shared across platforms, and picked up by major news outlets. The outpouring of support had been overwhelming, but it had also placed a new weight on his shoulders. Now, he wasn't just a victim. He was a symbol, a voice for the thousands of people who had experienced what he had. The days after the broadcast were filled with interviews, meetings with civil rights organizations, and discussions about the path forward. Michael had always been a private man, someone who preferred action over words. But now, he was thrust into a role he had never asked for, an advocate for justice. One afternoon, as he sat at his dining room table, his phone rang. It was a number he didn't recognize, but something compelled him to answer. "Hello?" Michael said, his voice wary. "General Anderson?" The voice on the other end was hesitant, almost unsure. "This is Officer Paul Jackson." Michael froze, his hand tightening around the phone. The name felt like a punch to the gut, the memory of that night flashing before his eyes. The humiliation, the anger, the fear, all of it came rushing back in an instant. There was a long pause on the line before Jackson spoke again. I wanted to apologize. I wanted to. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Michael didn't respond, unsure of how to process what he was hearing. "I know I can't take back what I did," Jackson continued, his voice low. "I acted out of bias, and I let my own prejudices cloud my judgment. You didn't deserve what happened to you, and I'm sorry for everything you went through because of me." Michael's chest tightened as he listened. He had imagined this moment countless times since the arrest. What he would say to the officer who had turned his life upside down. But now, with the apology hanging in the air, he found himself at a loss for words. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Jackson added quickly. "I just needed to say it, to own up to my actions." For a moment, the line went silent. Michael could hear the sincerity in Jackson's voice, the regret. But forgiveness? That was a different story. "I appreciate the apology," Michael said finally, his voice measured. "But this isn't just about you and me. It's about the system that allows this kind of thing to keep happening." "I know," Jackson said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And I'm trying to figure out how to be a part of the solution." Michael sighed, the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. He hadn't expected to hear from Jackson, much less have this conversation. And while the apology was a step, it didn't change the fact that the system was still broken. "I hope you do," Michael said. "Because this isn't just about you and me. This is bigger than both of us." As the days turned into weeks, the pressure on the police department continued to mount. The investigation into Jackson's actions was thorough, and eventually, the announcement came. Officer Paul Jackson had been terminated from the force. The decision sent shockwaves through the community, with some hailing it as a victory for justice, and others decrying it as an overreaction. But for Michael, it was a step in the right direction. It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a start. The protests continued, though their tone had begun to shift. What had started as anger and outrage was evolving into a broader movement for systemic reform. People were no longer just calling for individual accountability. They were demanding change at every level of law enforcement. Michael found himself at the center of it all, invited to speak at rallies and meetings with lawmakers. His words carried weight now, his voice amplified by the movement that had formed around him. But despite the attention, Michael remained focused on the bigger picture. This wasn't about him. It was about the countless others who had suffered in silence. One evening, as Michael stood before a crowd of protesters in Atlanta, he looked out at the sea of faces, people of all races, all backgrounds, standing together for a common cause. The unity he saw in that moment gave him hope. Hope that, despite the ugliness of what had happened, something good could come out of it. "This fight isn't just about one man or one officer," Michael said, his voice strong as it echoed through the crowd. "It's about a system that needs to change, a system that has failed too many for too long, and we won't stop until justice isn't just a word, it's a reality." The crowd erupted into cheers, their voices rising in unison. Michael felt a surge of emotion as he looked out at them. This was what he had been fighting for, not just for himself, but for all of them. Officer Jackson, now jobless and alone, had been watching the protests unfold from the isolation of his small apartment. He had thought about attending one of them, about standing in the crowd and listening to the voices calling for justice. But he couldn't bring himself to do it. The shame was too great, the weight of his actions too heavy. Instead, he sat in front of the television, watching the news coverage with a hollow feeling in his chest. He saw Michael standing before the crowd, heard his words calling for change. And for the first time in his life, Jackson understood the depth of the problem. He had been part of the system. He had contributed to the injustice. And now, he had to live with that knowledge. As the weeks went on, Jackson began to reach out to organizations dedicated to police reform. He attended meetings, listened to the stories of those who had been impacted by racial profiling, and slowly began to understand the full scope of the problem. It was a long road, but Jackson was determined to walk it, no matter how difficult. Months passed, and while the intensity of the protests began to slow, the push for reform didn't wane. The conversations about race, policing, and justice were no longer just flashes of public outcry. They had become embedded in the national discourse. Michael Anderson had emerged as a key figure in that conversation, though he never intended for it to be that way. One evening, Michael sat on the porch of his home, the warm summer air carrying the distant hum of the city. His children were playing in the yard, their laughter a soothing contrast to the heavy thoughts that weighed on him. Sarah sat beside him, her hand resting on his knee. "How are you feeling?" she asked softly. Michael sighed, staring off into the distance. "Tired," he admitted. "It's like the weight of this whole thing just keeps getting heavier. But at the same time, I can't walk away from it." Sarah nodded, understanding. She had watched as her husband had been thrust into the spotlight, taking on a role he hadn't asked for, but had accepted with grace. The man she knew, the strong, quiet soldier, had become a voice for justice, and the world was listening. "You've done more than enough," she said. "No one would blame you if you stepped back." Michael shook his head. "I can't. Not yet. There's still too much work to be done." He had seen the change happening, little by little. Local governments were beginning to enact policies aimed at curbing racial profiling, and police departments across the country were implementing new training programs focused on de-escalation and bias recognition. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. The wounds ran too deep, the system too flawed. Real change would take time, and Michael was committed to seeing it through. But as much as Michael had been focusing on the larger fight, there was still a personal reckoning he had yet to face. The events of that night, the feeling of being stripped of his dignity, the raw humiliation and fear. It lingered with him. It haunted him in the quiet moments, like a shadow that refused to fade. One afternoon, as he sat alone in his office, Michael's phone rang. He glanced at the screen, recognizing the number. It was from one of the civil rights organizations he had been working with. He answered, expecting another discussion about upcoming rallies or meetings with lawmakers, but the voice on the other end had something different in mind. "General Anderson, I've been in contact with Officer Jackson," the voice said. "He's asked if he could meet with you, privately." Michael's heart skipped a beat. The request caught him off guard, and for a moment, he didn't know how to respond. The last time he had heard from Jackson was during that brief, tense phone call when the officer had apologized. But a face-to-face meeting? That was something else entirely. "Why?" Michael asked, his voice tight. The man on the phone paused, as if weighing his words carefully. "Jackson's been attending some of our workshops. He's been working to understand the biases that led to what happened that night. He says he wants to make things right, at least as much as he can." Michael leaned back in his chair, the silence in the room pressing in on him. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this. The anger he had felt on the night of his arrest had dulled over time, but it hadn't disappeared. Could he sit across from the man who had put him in handcuffs for no reason? Could he listen to him try to explain away the years of bias that had built up in his heart? "I don't know," Michael said finally. "I'll have to think about it." "I understand," the man replied. "There's no pressure. But if you do decide you want to meet with him, we're here to facilitate it." Michael hung up the phone, his mind racing. He thought about the apology Jackson had offered over the phone, about the regret in his voice. But was it enough? Did regret alone make up for the harm that had been done? For days, Michael wrestled with the decision. He talked to Sarah about it, trying to make sense of his own emotions. She, as always, was his sounding board, helping him process the complexity of the situation. "If you meet with him, it doesn't mean you're forgiving him," she said one evening, as they sat in their living room. "But maybe it'll help you get some closure." "Maybe," Michael agreed, though he wasn't sure if closure was what he needed. What he wanted, what he had always wanted, was justice. But justice wasn't a simple thing. It wasn't just about Jackson losing his job or even about reforms in the system. Justice was about something deeper, about ensuring that what happened to him didn't happen to anyone else. And if meeting with Jackson helped move that forward, maybe it was worth it. 2 weeks later, Michael found himself sitting in a small conference room at a community center in Cleveland, Ohio, the soft hum of the air conditioner the only sound in the otherwise quiet space. He had agreed to the meeting, though not without reservations. He wasn't sure what he was expecting, or even what he wanted to get out of it. But he knew that he needed to see this through, if only for his own peace of mind. The door opened, and Officer Paul Jackson walked in. Michael felt a knot form in his stomach as he looked at the man who had changed his life forever. Jackson looked different than he had in his police uniform. He seemed smaller, more vulnerable, without the authority of the badge. He walked slowly, his eyes cast downward, as if he couldn't bear to meet Michael's gaze. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me," Jackson said, his voice quiet as he took a seat across from Michael. Michael nodded but didn't respond. He didn't trust himself to speak just yet. There was a long silence before Jackson finally looked up, his eyes meeting Michael's for the first time since that night. "I don't know how to start this," Jackson admitted. "But I know that I owe you more than just an apology. I owe you an explanation." Michael remained silent, waiting for him to continue. Jackson took a deep breath. "That night, I let my biases get the better of me. I saw you, and instead of seeing a man, I saw a threat. And that's not on you. That's on me. It's something I've been carrying for a long time, and I didn't even realize it until that night. I'm not going to make excuses. What I did was wrong, and I take full responsibility for that." Michael felt the tension in his body ease, just slightly. He wasn't sure if it was the words or the tone, but something about Jackson's confession felt different this time. It felt real. "I've been doing a lot of soul-searching since then," Jackson continued. "I've been attending these workshops, learning about my own biases, trying to unlearn the things I didn't even realize I was carrying. But I know that no amount of learning can undo what I did to you. I just want you to know that I'm trying. I'm trying to be better." Michael listened, his emotions a tangled mess of anger, sadness, and something else he couldn't quite name. He had spent months fighting for justice, fighting for change. And now, here was the man who had wronged him, sitting across from him, admitting to his mistakes and asking for understanding. But was it enough? "I appreciate you saying that," Michael said finally, his voice low. "But this isn't just about you and me. This is about a system that's broken. A system that allows officers like you to act on your biases and hurt people like me." Jackson nodded, his face solemn. "I know. And I'm trying to be a part of the change. I know it's not enough, but I'm trying." For a long moment, the two men sat in silence, the weight of their shared experience hanging between them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step. "I don't know where we go from here," Michael said honestly. "But I hope you mean what you're saying. Because this isn't just about one night. It's about making sure this doesn't keep happening." "I do mean it," Jackson said, his voice steady. "And I'm going to do everything I can to make sure it doesn't." The meeting ended with no grand gestures, no dramatic reconciliations. But as Michael left the community center, he felt lighter somehow. It wasn't closure, not yet, but it was a start. The fight for justice was far from over, but for the first time, Michael felt like he had taken a step forward. A small one, maybe, but a step nonetheless. The protests continued, the conversations about reform growing louder, and while Michael remained at the forefront of the movement, he also allowed himself to begin healing. He knew that the road ahead would be long, but he was ready for it, ready to keep fighting, ready to keep pushing for the change that was so desperately needed. Because justice, real justice, wasn't just about one man. It was about all of them,